Sloane raised her champagne glass, pointing at me before 120 guests. "This is my sister. She is just a 911 dispatcher," she announced. My mother laughed first, followed by my father. The luxurious tent echoed with their polite amusement. Only the groom remained silent. Everett set his glass down and stared at me with sudden, unreadable focus. A fracture had just opened in Sloane's perfect narrative, though no one else in the tent understood it yet. "I am Quinn Montgomery, and I am 32 years old. Tonight, I am sitting in the darkest corner of Briarwood Point House, a waterfront estate in Charleston where old money goes to celebrate itself. The room is a masterpiece of artificial perfection, bathed in warm amber light that makes the crystal centerpieces glitter like crushed diamonds. White orchids spill from every surface, and a live jazz quartet plays softly in the background, masking the sound of the ocean wind outside. There are 120 guests in this room, most of them draped in silk and quiet arrogance. And then there is me. I am wearing a dark blue dress I bought on a clearance rack for $65, and I have been seated at table 24. Table 24 is not just in the back, it is practically in the service corridor. I am positioned right next to the napkin station and the swinging wooden doors of the kitchen. Every 3 minutes, a waiter rushes past me, bringing a gust of hot air smelling of roasted duck and industrial dish soap. It is a calculated placement, a geometric expression of my exact worth in my family. At the front of the room, standing under a canopy of white roses, is my biological older sister, Sloane Montgomery, the bride. She holds a silver microphone with the casual elegance of a talk show host, turning the traditional family introductions into a high-stakes performance of social climbing. She is not just thanking people, she is presenting them as assets to her new, wealthy in-laws. "My mother, Celeste," Sloane says, gesturing gracefully toward our mother, who sits at the head table glowing with pride. The brilliant founder of her own boutique event consulting firm. She taught me that every detail matters. In reality, my mother coordinates freelance parties for mid-level corporate retreats, but tonight, she is a titan of industry. "And my father, Martin," Sloane continues, flashing a dazzling smile at the man who manages a regional chain of furniture warehouses, "a real estate investor who showed me the value of building a solid foundation." My father beams, puffing out his chest. He is a man perfectly accustomed to siding with whichever child brings in the most social capital. Sloane is the golden child. She works in high-end brand strategy. She knows how to perform, and she lives entirely for the gaze of other people. She curates our family like a curated magazine spread, cropping out anything that does not fit the aesthetic. I am the part she usually crops out. The jazz music dips. Sloane's eyes sweep the room, finally landing on the shadows near the kitchen doors. Her smile thins, losing its warmth but keeping its shape. It is the smile of a predator who has cornered her prey in front of an audience. "And of course, there is my sister, Quinn," Sloane announces, her voice echoing through the expensive sound system. "She is just a 911 dispatcher, so if anyone loses their valet ticket tonight, she can probably handle it." For a second, there is silence. Then, my mother laughs. It is a sharp, bright sound, signaling to the room that this is a brilliant joke. My father chuckles immediately after, loyal to the hierarchy. The cue is given. The entire luxurious tent ripples with the polite, cultured laughter of 120 guests who have no idea they are participating in an act of profound cruelty. They laugh because they think it is a clever bit of sibling rivalry. They laugh because Sloane has trained them to see me as the punchline. I do not stand up. I do not wave. I do not react. I simply sit in my cheap blue dress, staring straight ahead. My hand is wrapped around my water glass, fingers gripping the cool crystal so tightly that my knuckles have turned completely white under the dim lights. The ice clinks faintly against the glass, trembling with the suppressed force of my pulse. I have been silent my entire life. I have absorbed the slights, the rescheduled birthdays, the subtle exclusions, always choosing peace over conflict. I have let them define me as the fragile, unremarkable background character in Sloane's magnificent life. But as the laughter washes over me, something fundamental breaks inside my chest. It is a clean, sharp fracture. The silence I am holding onto tonight is no longer the silence of surrender. It is the silence of a loaded weapon. Up at the head table, only one person is not laughing. Everett Vale, the groom, holds a glass of champagne halfway to his mouth. He comes from a family that owns a massive logistics and shipping empire, the Vale Meridian Group. His wealth is the kind that whispers instead of shouts, the kind that demands absolute perfection. He looks uncomfortable with the joke, his jaw tightening as he glances from his new bride to the dark corner where I am sitting. Before Everett can say anything, before he can even lower his glass, the polished atmosphere of the wedding shatters. At table 22, just a few feet away from me, an elderly man in a tuxedo suddenly drops his fork. It clatters loudly against his china plate. He grips the edge of the table with both hands, his face draining of color as his breathing turns fast and ragged. His wife screams, pushing her chair back. The surrounding guests recoil in horror, their social graces completely useless in the face of sudden, raw panic. Waiters freeze in their tracks. The jazz band abruptly stops playing. He cannot breathe. "Somebody help him," the wife shrieks, her voice cutting through the remaining laughter like a siren. Chaos threatens to swallow the room, but I am already moving. I do not think. I operate. The panic of other people is my daily office environment. While the rest of the room sees a tragedy unfolding, I see a checklist. I push past a paralyzed waiter, dropping my clutch onto the floor, and slide in beside the gasping man. He is hyperventilating, his eyes wide and terrified, his hands trembling violently as he claws at his collar. "Sir, look at me," I say. My voice is no longer the quiet, agreeable tone of Sloane's sister. It is the flat, commanding, perfectly calibrated voice of a Harbor Point emergency communications dispatcher. It is a voice designed to cut through hysteria and anchor a human soul to the earth. The man's eyes dart wildly before locking onto mine. He is drowning in his own fear. I place my hands gently but firmly on his shoulders, forcing him to remain seated and grounding him in the present moment. I inhale deeply, making sure he watches my chest rise. "Breathe in with me," I instruct, keeping my tone steady and completely devoid of panic. "Hold it. Now let it out." He tries, but it is a jagged, shallow gasp. His wife is sobbing loudly behind me, making it worse. I do not look at her. I maintain unbroken eye contact with the man. "You're panicking, but you're safe," I tell him, my words sharp and clear. "Match my breathing. We are going to count." He shakes his head, tears forming in the corners of his eyes. "I cannot." "Look right here," I command, tapping my own collarbone. "Focus on my voice. Only my voice." The room around us has gone entirely silent. 120 guests are holding their breath. Watching the dispatcher they just laughed at take absolute control of the situation. I lean in closer, lowering my voice so that it becomes the center of his universe. "Count with me," I say, delivering the exact phrase that has saved dozens of lives through my headset. "Do not count your fear." The man stares at me. A tremor runs through his body. And then, miraculously, he takes a shuddering breath. I count out loud. 1, 2, 3, 4. He follows along, his chest rising and falling in time with my voice. Slowly, the terrifying shade of gray leaves his face. The rigid panic in his muscles begins to dissolve. Within 2 minutes, he is breathing normally, leaning back in his chair, exhausted but entirely present. I step back, gesturing for a waiter to bring a glass of water, my face a mask of absolute calm. From the head table, the sound of a heavy crystal glass hitting the wood echoes loudly. I look up. Everett Vale is standing. He is not looking at his bride. He is not looking at his wealthy parents or the crowd of elite guests. Everett is staring directly at me, his face pale, his eyes wide with a sudden, devastating recognition. The champagne glass he just slammed onto the table has spilled, pooling around the white orchids, but he does not notice. He heard me. The acoustics of the silent room carried my voice perfectly. Count with me. Do not count your fear. I watched the realization hit him like a physical blow. Everett is no longer in a luxurious wedding tent in Charleston. In his mind, he is thrust 4 years into the past, trapped in a flooded house during Hurricane Delphine. He is standing in rising water, staring at his father's lifeless body, gripping a phone to his ear while the storm rages outside. And he is hearing the exact same voice, the calm, authoritative, anchor of a voice that stayed on the line with him for 20 minutes, forcing him to do chest compressions, guiding him through the dark, keeping his family alive when everything else was falling apart. The anonymous dispatcher who saved his life. He looks at me. The quiet sister in the cheap dress sitting by the kitchen doors. He looks at Sloane. The woman who has just humiliated me. The gears in his head turn, snapping into place with brutal precision. The fabricated narrative Sloane has built around me begins to crack, and in the span of a single heartbeat, the groom realizes that his entire wedding is built on a lie. 3 weeks before the wedding, I sat on the floor of my cramped apartment, staring at the mail I had just brought up. My apartment is a 4th-floor walk-up on the industrial side of town. The radiator hisses violently during the winter, and the hot water's a suggestion rather than a guarantee. I pay the rent entirely by myself. I paid my own college tuition. I rotate my own tires and fix the leaky pipes under my kitchen sink because I learned very early that nobody was coming to rescue me. Independence was not a choice I made. It was a survival mechanism handed to me by the people who were supposed to be my safety net. To understand how I ended up sitting in the dark corner of Briarwood Point House, you have to understand the geography of my family. It is a landscape where I have always been treated as a backup option, a spare part kept in the garage just in case the primary engine fails. In my parents' house, the grand staircase is lined with heavy, silver-framed photographs. It is a museum dedicated exclusively to the glory of Sloane Montgomery. There is Sloane holding a silver trophy in high school, Sloane laughing on a sailboat during a summer trip to the Hamptons, Sloane looking effortlessly perfect in her graduation gown. If you look closely at some of the older pictures, you might notice a sliver of a shoulder or half of a face at the extreme edge of the frame. That is me. I was always positioned just far enough to the side so that when my mother ordered the standard 8x10 prints, the automatic cropping tool would slice me right out of the family history. My birthdays were regularly rescheduled to accommodate Sloane's social calendar. If she had a cheerleading retreat, my cake was pushed back a week. If she was going through a minor breakup, my celebrations were canceled entirely because the house needed to be a sanctuary for her healing. My achievements, whenever I managed to force them into the conversation, were met with polite nods. When I won a regional debate championship, my father patted my shoulder and said it was fine, before immediately asking Sloane about her upcoming fashion show. The hardest part to swallow has always been the biology of it all. We are not a blended family. There is no second marriage, no stepchildren to create a natural divide in loyalties. Sloane and I share the exact same blood. We were born to the exact same mother and the exact same father. That makes the favoritism infinitely more painful. I could never blame my isolation on the awkward growing pains of a new marriage. I had to look at my parents and accept that they simply evaluated their 2 biological daughters and made a clear, conscious choice. They chose the daughter who looked like a magazine cover. Sloane is undeniably beautiful, but her real talent lies in her ability to perform. She works as a high-end brand strategist, a title that perfectly encapsulates her entire existence. She does not just live her life, she curates it. She treats every interaction as a public relations campaign, constantly managing the narrative, ensuring she is always the protagonist, the victim, or the savior, depending on what the audience requires. She feeds on the gaze of other people. Without it, I am convinced she would cease to exist. I am the antithesis of everything she values. I am not loud. I do not command a room when I walk into it. I do not wear designer clothes, and my hair is usually pulled back into a messy knot. I work the night shift at the Harbor Point Emergency Communications Center. For 12 hours at a time, I sit in a windowless room illuminated only by the harsh glare of computer monitors. I wear a heavy headset, and I listen to people on the worst days of their lives. I hear the raw, unfiltered sound of human panic. I hear mothers screaming for their unresponsive children. I hear the terrifying silence of a caller who can no longer find the strength to speak. My world is grounded in brutal, unglamorous reality. Whenever I made the mistake of trying to share my life with them, Sloane would expertly shut it down. We would be sitting at the dinner table, the expensive porcelain clinking, and I would mention a difficult call I had navigated that week. I would not share the gory details, just the emotional weight of holding a stranger together. Sloane would dab her mouth with a linen napkin, tilt her head, and offer a smile dripping with condescension. You just sit and listen to the phone. Quinn, it is basically customer service. Let us not make it sound like you are performing surgery. I would look across the table at my parents, waiting for them to intervene, waiting for my father to say that my job mattered, waiting for my mother to acknowledge the dark circles under my eyes from working back-to-back 12-hour shifts. But they never did. They would simply look at their plates or politely change the subject back to Sloane's latest marketing pitch, because they never contradicted her. Sloane's dismissal gradually hardened into indisputable truth within the walls of our family home. Quinn just answers phones. Quinn is just a receptionist for emergencies. Over the years, my role in the family dwindled into pure utility. I was only invited to dinners when they needed an exact number of guests at the table to make the seating chart work. I was called upon to help move heavy boxes of Sloane's discarded designer clothes. Most importantly, I was kept around to serve as the drab, unpolished contrast to my sister's brilliant light. Every masterpiece requires a dark background to make the colors pop. I was the dark background, deep down in the most guarded corners of my heart. I had stopped hoping for their affection a long time ago. The childish desire to be loved unconditionally had burned out, replaced by a cold, hardened ash. I did not need them to love me anymore. What I desperately craved, what I still foolishly hoped for, was simply to be acknowledged. I wanted them to look at me and see a serious, capable adult who held human lives in her hands. I wanted the basic dignity of being recognized as a person of value. But week after week, year after year, even that modest hope was relentlessly eroded by their casual cruelty. All of this history brought me back to the envelope sitting on my apartment floor 3 weeks ago. It was thick, heavy cream cardstock, embossed with elegant gold lettering. The return address belonged to my mother. I slid my thumb under the seal and pulled out the wedding invitation. It was heavy in my hands, a physical manifestation of Sloane's grand production. I scanned the beautiful calligraphy, tracing the details of the Charleston venue and the evening reception. Then, my eyes fell on the inner envelope, the one explicitly naming the invited guest. It read, Quinn Marie Montgomery. My middle name is not Marie. It is Margaret. I stared at the looping golden letters. My own sister, my own mother who had given birth to me and named me 32 years ago, had either forgotten my middle name or had not cared enough to proofread the guest list before sending it to the printer. It was a tiny, devastating error that perfectly summarized my existence in their minds. I flipped the envelope over. There was no +1 written beneath my name. Every other unmarried adult in our family had been given the option to bring a guest. I was expected to attend alone, to sit by myself, easily managed and easily ignored. Tucked inside the layers of tissue paper and RSVP cards was a small, pale pink sticky note. The handwriting belonged to my mother, sharp and hurried. There was no greeting, no expression of excitement about having her family together for the wedding. Just a single, explicitly clear directive. Please do not make anything complicated for Sloane. I sat on the worn floorboards of my apartment, holding the pink square of paper. The radiator hissed in the background. I did not cry. I just folded the invitation, placed it back into the envelope, and realized that my family did not want me at the wedding. They wanted a prop. They wanted the quiet, obedient sister who would sit by the kitchen doors and let Sloane shine. They had written the script, and they expected me to play my part exactly as I always had. 2 days before the grand reception, the suffocating performance began at the pre-wedding brunch. I had driven my 10-year-old sedan through the wrought iron gates of the Vale family estate, parking it carefully between a sleek black town car and a vintage silver roadster. I was only there because my mother had called me the previous evening, her voice tight with anxiety, declaring that this brunch was the final opportunity for our family to look appropriately standard before the main events. Standard, in her vocabulary, meant blending into the background so flawlessly that no one would think to ask any questions. The Vale estate was a masterclass in quiet, terrifying wealth. They did not flaunt their money with gold fixtures or loud, imported sports cars. The Vales owned the Vale Meridian Group, a titan in logistics, ice, and shipping. Their power was the kind that possessed an undeniable gravity, causing people to instinctively lower their voices and straighten their spines the moment they stepped onto the property. The house smelled of polished mahogany, old paper, and fresh eucalyptus. Waitstaff moved invisibly, replacing half-empty mimosas before the glass could even leave a water ring on the heavy stone tables. I stood near a massive bay window overlooking the private dock, nursing a single cup of black coffee. Across the room, Sloane was in her element. She wore a tailored ivory pantsuit that probably cost more than 3 months of my rent, gliding between groups of Everett's relatives like a seasoned diplomat. She was not just mingling, she was running a high-stakes public relations campaign for our family. I watched as she introduced our parents to a circle of Vale uncles and aunts. "And these are my wonderful parents," Sloane said, her voice carrying just enough for me to hear. "My mother, Celeste, is the visionary founder of a boutique event consulting brand. She has such an incredible eye for high-level curation. And my father, Martin, is a boutique real estate investor. He really specializes in bespoke commercial properties." I took a slow sip of my bitter coffee to hide my expression. A boutique event consulting brand was certainly one way to describe coordinating discounted catering for mid-level corporate team-building exercises. A bespoke real estate investor was a fascinating rebranding of managing a struggling chain of regional furniture warehouses. But the Vales nodded politely, murmuring their approval. Sloane had seamlessly repackaged our profoundly average, middle-class existence into something that sounded palatable to billionaires. The charade worked perfectly until a tall, sharp-eyed woman, whom I presumed to be one of Everett's aunts, turned her gaze away from the glittering center of the room and noticed me standing quietly by the window. She detached herself from the group and approached, her heels clicking softly against the hardwood floor. "Hello," the woman said, offering a polite but assessing smile. "I do not believe we have met. I am Beatrice, Everett's aunt. You must be the sister." "I am Quinn," I replied, extending my hand. "It is a pleasure to meet you." "Sloane speaks so highly of her family," Beatrice said, her eyes scanning my simple gray dress. "What is it that you do? Quinn, are you in the consulting business with your mother?" I opened my mouth to answer, fully prepared to state my job title with the same flat, unapologetic tone I used for everything else. But before the first syllable could leave my lips, the scent of expensive floral perfume enveloped me. Sloane materialized at my side, slipping her arm through mine in a gesture that looked affectionate to an outsider but felt exactly like a vice grip. "Oh, Quinn works in County Dispatch," Sloane intervened smoothly, her voice a flawless melody of practiced sweetness. "But we try not to talk about work too much today. Quinn really does not like social pressure. She is a bit delicate, you know. She prefers a much quieter environment." Sloane squeezed my arm, her nails digging slightly into my skin through the fabric of my dress. It was a physical command to stay silent. Beatrice's expression softened into something resembling pity. "Oh, I see. Well, it is lovely that you could join us today. Quinn, I am sure large gatherings can be quite overwhelming." "She is managing beautifully," Sloane assured her, offering a brave, protective smile. "I am just so glad she could be here for the photos." Beatrice nodded sympathetically and drifted back toward the buffet, leaving me anchored to the floor by my sister's grip. The moment Beatrice was out of earshot, Sloane dropped my arm as if I had suddenly caught fire. She did not even look at me as she spun around and walked briskly toward the hallway leading to the powder rooms. I waited exactly 30 seconds before following her. I did not want a confrontation, but I needed to put my coffee cup down in the kitchen, which required passing the alcove near the restrooms. As I approached the shadowed corridor, I heard the hushed, urgent voices of my sister and my mother. I stopped, pressing myself flat against the patterned wallpaper. "You have to manage her, Mom," Sloane was whispering fiercely. "She is just standing there looking like a lost orphan." Beatrice was already interrogating her. "I am trying, Sloane," my mother replied, her voice fluttering with nervous energy. I could hear the rustle of fabric, likely my mother adjusting one of the decorative table runners on the console table, a nervous habit she exhibited whenever she felt she was losing control. "She is behaving. She is just drinking her coffee. She only needs to appear in the family photo," Sloane instructed, her tone devoid of any warmth. "That is it, after the photographer gets the shots of us on the staircase. Keep her away from the microphone. Keep her away from Everett. Most importantly, keep her away from his mother. Helen is already looking for reasons to judge us. If Quinn starts talking about car crashes and domestic disputes, it will ruin the entire aesthetic." "I will keep her busy," my mother conceded quickly. "You know your father hates drama. We have to keep tonight smooth. Just focus on Everett and leave the rest to me." I stood frozen against the wall, the heavy realization settling into my bones like lead. For years, I had convinced myself that Sloane simply looked down on me because I did not fit into her glamorous world. I thought her dismissals were born out of ordinary, garden-variety arrogance. But listening to her orchestrate my isolation in this quiet hallway, I finally understood the terrifying depth of her strategy. Sloane was not just embarrassed by me. She was actively building a distorted, weaponized version of me for the Vale family. She was feeding them a narrative where I was fragile, socially awkward, and mentally unstable. By painting me as a delicate liability, she guaranteed that no one in Everett's family would ever take me seriously or try to engage me in meaningful conversation. She was preemptively burying me so deep underground that my voice would never threaten her perfect image. I turned around silently and walked out the back doors onto the terrace, the cold stones seeping through the thin soles of my shoes. The air was crisp, smelling of salt water and impending rain. I found a secluded corner behind a massive stone planter, needing a moment to breathe the uncontaminated air. 10 minutes later, the heavy glass doors opened a few feet away. I remained hidden behind the overgrown foliage of the planter. Sloane stepped out onto the terrace, holding a fresh glass of champagne. She was not alone. Her maid of honor, a woman named Jessica, who mirrored Sloane's polished cruelty perfectly, was walking right beside her. "Is your sister surviving?" Jessica asked, a lazy smirk evident in her voice. She looked like she was going to pass out when Beatrice cornered her. Sloane let out a short, dismissive laugh. It was a cold, hollow sound that echoed off the stone walls. "She is fine as long as nobody asks her to be a normal, functioning adult," Sloane replied, taking a delicate sip of her drink. "I have it under control. Mom is running interference." "Good," Jessica murmured. "You deserve absolute perfection this weekend. You work too hard for this." "Exactly," Sloane said. Her voice dropped, becoming harder, sharper, stripping away the last remaining layers of her carefully constructed facade. "I have spent 3 years building this relationship. I have curated every single detail of this weekend. My wedding day will not be hijacked by the girl who makes a living off other people's crises." Stepping into the Harbor Point Emergency Communications Center is like stepping into the raw, unshielded nervous system of a sprawling city. It is a cavernous, windowless room dominated by the harsh, clinical blue glow of dozens of computer monitors. The air inside the center always smells faintly of ozone, stale adrenaline, and cold coffee left abandoned on desks. The digital wall clock is massive, silently ticking away the agonizing seconds of a 12-hour shift. To my family, I am just a receptionist who handles complaints. In reality, I am the gatekeeper between a living breath and a dead silence. I do not just answer phones. I triage human suffering in real time. I sit perfectly still in an ergonomic chair while tracking 4 separate digital maps, typing incident reports at over 90 words per minute, and coordinating complex responses between police cruisers, heavy fire engines, and emergency medical technicians. I am the one who has to weigh the value of emergencies. I am the one who must decide if a multi-car collision on the interstate takes priority over a silent panic alarm at a domestic residence. I decide the exact order in which human lives are approached, saved, or sometimes unavoidably lost. I hide my own racing pulse, the cold sweat on the back of my neck, and my own absolute terror behind a perfectly modulated, entirely calm voice. My shift supervisor is Rhea Donnelly. Rhea is a woman carved entirely from ice, logic, and decades of secondary trauma. She has spent 25 years listening to the absolute worst moments of humanity and has never once lost her composure. Rhea does not believe in handing out empty praise, but whenever the board lights up with the most chaotic, violently unraveling situations, she bypasses the other dispatchers and routes those calls directly to my station. She once stood behind my chair, watching my hands fly across the keyboard, and told me, "Your voice holds the heartbeat of other people. Montgomery, you do not let them shatter." That single sentence was the highest honor I have ever received in my life. That carefully controlled tone was the only thing standing between a desperate man and total darkness 4 years ago. It was the night Hurricane Delphine completely leveled our coastline. The storm surge swallowed the lower peninsula. Coastal roads vanished under fast-moving black water, and the city power grid collapsed entirely within the first 3 hours of landfall. Our dispatch board was a solid, terrifying wall of flashing red lights. It was an apocalyptic symphony of ringing phones and radio static. I keyed my headset, took a deep breath, and opened the next line. 911, what is your emergency? I asked, my voice steady against the chaos of the room. The voice on the other end of the line was frantic, breathless, and completely unspooled. It was Everett Vale. I did not know his last name at the time, nor did I know he belonged to a family of unimaginable wealth. In that moment, he was stripped of all his money and status. He was simply a terrified son watching his world end. He and his father, Graham, were trapped in a massive waterfront estate situated right on the edge of the swelling marshlands. Graham had gone out to the flooded garage to manually pull the cord on a heavy diesel generator. He had suddenly collapsed and was now lying totally unresponsive in a rapidly flooding mudroom. "He is not breathing!" Everett screamed into the receiver. The sound of hurricane-force winds battering the roof was deafening in the background. "The water is coming under the doors. You have to send an ambulance right now, please." I checked the dispatch map on my secondary screen. The entire southern sector was glowing a vicious red. All roads leading to the marsh were completely submerged under 6 feet of water. "Sir, I need you to listen to me very carefully," I said, intentionally dropping my voice an octave to cut through his rising hysteria. "Rescue units cannot reach your sector right now due to the extreme flooding. I am going to help you save him, but you have to do exactly what I tell you." Everett was actively hyperventilating, the panic threatening to paralyze his muscles entirely. I held him on the speakerphone for over 20 agonizing minutes. I systematically walked him through the physical nightmare of dragging his father's dead weight out of the rising contaminated water and pulling him onto the dry hardwood floor of the elevated kitchen. "Is there an automated external defibrillator in the house?" I asked, knowing that sprawling wealthy estates often kept medical equipment on hand. He frantically searched and found one in a hallway utility closet. I instructed him precisely on how to tear open his father's wet shirt, dry the chest completely with a towel, and place the conductive pads. I listened through the headset as the robotic voice of the machine analyzed the erratic heart rhythm, followed by the violent, heavy thud of the electric shock. But the machine was not enough. I had to teach a man in the middle of a screaming hurricane how to manually pump blood through his father's failing heart. "Interlock your fingers," I commanded, projecting absolute authority. "Place the heel of your hand on the center of his chest. Push hard and push fast." He started, but his rhythm was erratic, wild with terror. "I cannot do this," he sobbed loudly. "I am going to lose him." To make matters worse, the floodwater was still rising in the lower levels. I knew that if the water reached the active electrical outlets, they would both be electrocuted instantly. I ordered him to pause chest compressions for 10 critical seconds, sprint to the utility box, and throw the main breaker switch, plunging the two of them into total darkness. When he returned to his father's side in the pitch-black room, his spirit was completely broken. The physical exhaustion and the blinding terror were consuming him. That was the moment I had to give him a rhythm. That was the moment I became his anchor. "Focus on my voice," I told him, projecting over the roar of the wind. "Count with me. Do not count your fear. 1, 2, 3, 4. I forced him to push his weight down onto his father's chest on every single count. Whenever his voice wavered, whenever he started to cry out in despair, I pulled him right back to the numbers. "Count with me. Do not count your fear." We maintained that brutal, exhausting rhythm for 20 solid minutes in the dark, fighting off death second by second, until a specialized high-water rescue team finally smashed through the front window and took over the scene. Graham Vale lived. Everett Vale kept breathing. I simply took off my headset, wiped the cold sweat from my forehead, and pressed the button to take the next call. 2 weeks later, I received an official internal commendation from the center, a heavy-framed certificate of valor signed directly by the county commissioner. I took it home to my empty apartment, but I did not hang it up on the wall. I certainly did not mention a single word of it to my family. The last time I had ever made the mistake of trying to share the reality of a successful rescue with them. I had barely finished the story before Sloane interrupted me from across the living room. She had looked up from scrolling on her phone, her face twisting into a cruel, mocking little smile, and asked, "Did anyone manage to get a video clip of it? Or is it just another made-up story inside your headset?" After that day, I learned to keep my victories entirely in the dark, exactly where I had earned them. The rehearsal dinner took place on a Friday evening, exactly 24 hours before the wedding ceremony. It was hosted in the grand glass conservatory of a historic botanical garden, a space that was undeniably magnificent but functioned practically as a greenhouse. The air inside was thick with the suffocating scent of blooming jasmine and trapped humidity. Upon my arrival, my mother immediately intercepted me near the coat check. She reached out, her fingers clamping tightly around my wrist, pulling me slightly away from the arriving guests. "Remember your place tonight," she whispered, her voice tight with nervous energy. "Do not talk much about your work. Nobody wants to hear depressing emergency stories while they are eating roasted quail. Do not make people uncomfortable with those graphic details. We need this evening to be absolutely flawless." I was systematically directed to a small, wobbly table near the catering entrance, seated with a few distant, elderly cousins and the frustrated floral designer who was still adjusting the centerpieces. For the first 2 hours, I remained an obedient shadow. I drank sparkling water and watched Sloane glide across the marble floor, performing her role as the radiant bride to absolute perfection. By 8 o'clock, the heat inside the conservatory had become genuinely oppressive. The crowd was dense, the ambient noise was deafening, and the ventilation system was failing to keep up with the sheer number of bodies. I was standing near a tall cocktail table, trying to catch a breeze from a slightly opened window, when an elderly gentleman standing a few feet away suddenly swayed. I recognized him from the speeches earlier. He was a major philanthropic donor to the Vale Meridian Group and a close personal friend of Everett's father. The man dropped his cocktail napkin, gripping the edge of the high table so hard his knuckles turned white. His face flushed a dangerous shade of crimson, and his breath began to hitch in shallow, ragged gasps. The guests immediately surrounding him took a collective step back, their social graces completely paralyzing their ability to help. My dispatcher training instantly bypassed my mother's stern warnings. I closed the distance between us in 3 rapid steps, catching the gentleman by his elbow just as his knees began to buckle. I guided his weight down onto a nearby wrought iron bench, positioning myself squarely in front of him to block the staring crowd. "Look right at me, sir," I instructed, my voice naturally dropping into the flat, commanding cadence I used for every crisis. He looked up, his eyes wide with disorientation and rising panic. He was overwhelmed by the heat, the tight collar of his dress shirt, and the crushing anxiety of a public medical episode. "You're overheated and panicking, but you're safe," I told him, keeping my tone steady. I tapped my chest to draw his focus away from the room. "Match my breathing. 1, 2, 3, 4. I repeated the numbers, projecting a calm authority that forced his erratic breathing into a slow, manageable rhythm. Within 2 minutes, his shoulders dropped. The terrifying redness faded from his cheeks, and he nodded in silent gratitude as a waiter rushed over with a glass of ice water. I stood up, stepping back into the shadows, but as I turned, I froze. Everett Vale was standing exactly 10 feet away. He had a glass of scotch in his hand, but he was not drinking it. He was staring at me with the strained focus of someone trying to place a voice he should not know. I watched uncertainty harden into suspicion for the first time. He was no longer looking at me as Sloane's quiet sister, but as someone he needed to understand for himself. Sloane missed absolutely nothing. She had been tracking Everett's movements across the room, and she saw the devastating shift in his attention. Before I could retreat to my assigned table near the kitchen, Sloane materialized beside me. Her hand clamped onto my upper arm with bruising force. She did not say a single word as she dragged me through the crowd, her smile fixed perfectly in place for the guests, while her fingers dug painfully into my skin. She shoved me into the luxurious, marble-tiled powder room and locked the heavy oak door behind us. "What do you think you are doing?" Sloane demanded, her voice shaking with a terrifying, suppressed rage. Her eyes were completely wild. "A man was passing out from the heat," I replied calmly, rubbing my bruised arm. I helped him breathe. "You are doing this on purpose," she hissed, taking a step toward me. "You are trying to draw attention to yourself. I am warning you. Quinn, tomorrow night, you sit perfectly still. You smile for the camera. You eat your food. You do not talk to his family. And you absolutely do not turn yourself into some tragic, inspiring story. Do you understand me?" She did not wait for my answer. She unlocked the door and stormed out, leaving me standing alone in the quiet, glaringly bright bathroom. I waited 5 minutes before exiting, needing the residual adrenaline to leave my system. When I finally walked back out into the perimeter of the main room, I tried to make my way toward the secluded outdoor terrace. As I navigated around a large floral display, I found myself standing directly behind a small, intimate circle of guests. Helen Vale, Everett's mother, was standing in the center, speaking with immense passion to a few older women. "We are incredibly proud of the foundation," Helen was saying, her voice thick with emotion. "Graham and I make sure to fund the first responder grants every single year. We maintain that charity for one specific reason. An unknown voice on the radio saved my husband during the hurricane 4 years ago. We never found out who she was, but we owe her everything." I stopped dead in my tracks. A massive, freezing jolt ran straight down my spine. The hurricane, the flooded house, the unresponsive father. The man I had saved in the dark 4 years ago was Graham Vale. The terrified son on the other end of the line had been Everett. The sheer impossibility of the connection made my head spin. I had to grip the edge of a nearby pillar to steady myself as the fragmented pieces of my reality violently crashed into each other. Needing air, I turned and walked quickly out of the conservatory. moving down the long carpeted hallway of the estate's main house. I wandered past several closed doors until I reached a private study that the Vale family was using to store their personal belongings for the weekend. The door was slightly ajar, and a warm desk lamp illuminated the dark mahogany furniture. I stepped inside simply to escape the noise, but my eyes were immediately drawn to a heavy, silver-framed document resting carefully on the center of the leather desk blotter. I walked closer, my heart hammering against my ribs. It was an official letter of gratitude, embossed with the Vale Meridian Group corporate seal. It was addressed to Dispatcher Unknown. The text praised the extraordinary bravery and life-saving guidance provided during the catastrophic flooding of Hurricane Delphine. I reached out, my fingers hovering just above the glass frame. It was my rescue. It was my voice. They had framed my invisible presence and kept it in their most private spaces. Suddenly, the sound of hurried footsteps echoed in the hallway. I quickly backed away from the desk and slipped behind the heavy velvet curtains near the bookshelf. My mother and Sloane walked briskly past the open door of the study, stopping just a few feet down the corridor. I held my breath, completely hidden in the shadows. "You need to calm down," Sloane, my mother said, her voice strained with exhaustion. "Everett was just surprised to see her help that man. It means nothing." "You did not see his face, Mom," Sloane shot back, her tone dripping with a frantic, ugly desperation. "He was staring at her. He recognized something." "I know he did." "Recognized what?" my mother asked, clearly confused. Sloane let out a shaky, furious breath. The words she spoke next chilled the blood in my veins. "If they connect Quinn to that storm, this entire wedding becomes about her. They will look at her like a hero, and they will look at me like a liar. I will not allow it. I will do whatever it takes to keep her completely silent tomorrow." I arrived at Briarwood Point House precisely at 9 o'clock in the morning. The air was crisp, carrying the sharp scent of the ocean and the frantic, buzzing energy of a $1 million production. The morning was entirely dedicated to photography, a grueling exercise in creating a manufactured reality. I was directed to stand on the manicured front lawn, wearing a stiff smile that felt like wet clay drying on my face. The wind whipped my hair, but I was not allowed to move. Sloane stood in the center of the lawn, a breathtaking vision in custom silk and imported lace. Our parents flanked her tightly, their faces glowing with immense, unfeigned pride. I was positioned at the absolute edge of the group, standing nearly a full foot away from my father's shoulder. I watched my sister subtly gesture to the hired photographer, a man who charged tens of thousands of dollars to capture and edit this joy. "Just make sure you leave a generous amount of negative space on the left side," Sloane instructed him, her voice light, airy, and entirely lethal. "I want the ocean to really frame the composition. It needs to look vast." I was standing on the left side. The negative space was me. She was actively directing the photographer to frame the shot so that I could be effortlessly cropped out of the final album with a single click of a mouse. I was a temporary prop, soon to be deleted from the historical record of her perfect day, while I was being physically erased on the lawn. I would later learn that a completely different timeline was accelerating inside the quiet walls of the Vale family estate. Everett was not putting on his tailored tuxedo. He was not drinking expensive scotch with his groomsmen or laughing about his impending honeymoon. He was standing in his father's private library, desperately asking his mother a question that would unravel the entire weekend. "Where is the insurance file from Hurricane Delphine?" Everett asked Helen, his voice sharp and demanding. Helen, already dressed in her elegant silver evening gown, paused near the heavy wooden doorway. "The old storm records." "Everett, your wedding begins in 4 hours. Why on earth are you thinking about that nightmare right now?" "Just tell me where the box is. Mom, please." "It is incredibly important." Helen frowned deeply but walked over to the heavy oak filing cabinets tucked in the corner. "Your father had the insurance lawyers pull absolutely everything they could when we were fighting the property damage claim against the city. He tried his hardest to get the dispatch audio to prove the exact timeline of his cardiac arrest, but the county refused to release the full voice recording. They claimed it was a privacy issue. They only provided the official written transcripts and some internal processing notes. Everett pulled the thick manila folder from the drawer and spread the dusty documents across the mahogany desk. His hands were not shaking, but there was a rigid, dangerous tension in his shoulders. He flipped past the water damage assessments, the contractor estimates, and the dense legal correspondence until he finally found the dispatch logs. Pinned to the back of the official timeline transcript was a copy of an internal county commendation, forwarded by a supervisor to justify the delayed emergency response times in our sector. Everett traced his finger down the crisp page, his eyes scanning the bureaucratic text until he stopped completely. There it was, printed in stark black ink. The name of the dispatcher who handled the 20-minute call, Quinn Montgomery. Everett stared at my name until the last doubt gave way. Same county, same job, same voice. What he had heard at the rehearsal dinner was not a coincidence. It was confirmation. Back at the venue, my isolation was not just photographic, it was geographic. I walked into the massive reception tent to find my assigned seat at table 24. It was pushed so far back into the shadows that the back legs of my chair practically scraped against the swinging wooden doors of the catering kitchen. I looked at the table's centerpiece. Every other table in the room boasted a towering, extravagant explosion of white orchids and trailing ivy. Table 24 featured a distinctly smaller, noticeably sparser arrangement. It was a petty, brilliant calculation. Sloane had ensured that her deep contempt for me was physically manifested in the geometry and the floral budget of the room. As I stared at the pathetic cluster of flowers, my mother suddenly grabbed my arm from behind. Her grip was startlingly tight. She pulled me aggressively away from the tables and dragged me into a narrow, unlit alcove near the staff restrooms. The smell of industrial bleach and roasted vegetables hung heavy in the warm air. "You made it through the morning photos," my mother whispered harshly, her eyes darting around to make sure we were entirely alone in the corridor. "Since you are already here, Quinn, I need you to try to sacrifice just one more night for this family. Sit in your chair, eat your dinner, and do not cause a single scene. Do not speak unless spoken to, and do not embarrass us in front of the Vales." I looked at the woman who had brought me into the world. The cold, hardened ash in my chest suddenly flared into something hot, sharp, and uncontrollable. "Did you let her do it?" I asked, my voice deadly quiet, cutting through the ambient noise of the kitchen staff. "Did you stand there and let Sloane tell Everett's family that I am mentally unstable?" My father had quietly followed us into the alcove, lurking just behind my mother. At my direct question, he immediately averted his eyes, staring intensely at the scuff marks on the linoleum floor. He refused to look at me, his jaw clamped shut. His pathetic silence was a complete and absolute confession. My mother, however, did not look away. She reached out and smoothed the collar of my cheap blue dress, a maternal gesture that was totally devoid of any actual affection. It was a movement designed to manage a problem, not comfort a daughter. "You know your sister needs everything to be perfect," my mother said softly, her tone sickeningly reasonable. "This is her day, Quinn. Why do you always have to make it about yourself?" That was the clearest betrayal yet. She was not passively allowing Sloane to do this. She was helping her do it. My reputation and dignity were expendable to her if it kept the wedding intact. I did not yell or cry. I stepped back, broke her touch, and walked out of the alcove without another word. I returned to the deep shadows of the beautiful tent, resigning myself to the perimeter of the room. I sat down at the table 24, listening to the clatter of silverware and the tuning of the jazz band's instruments. But while I prepared to endure the final act of my sister's grand, deceitful performance, the groom was preparing to tear the entire theater down. Everett stood alone in his father's study, gripping the piece of paper with my name on it so tightly that the edges crumpled. He pulled his phone from his pocket. He did not text Sloane to demand an explanation. He did not confront his father with the revelation. He opened a secure message thread with his mother. His fingers moved quickly over the glowing screen, typing out a single, definitive command that would change the trajectory of all our lives. Do not say anything yet. I need proof before I blow up my wedding." He hit send, folded the piece of paper into a small, tight square, and tucked it securely into the inner pocket of his tuxedo jacket, right over his heart. The storm was no longer just approaching the coast. It had officially made landfall. The formal welcome toasts began shortly after the catering staff cleared the second course from the tables. The jazz band faded into a soft, instrumental hum, and the ambient lighting in the massive tent shifted to a warm, golden glow. Sloane stood up at the head table, holding a silver microphone with the practiced ease of a stage actress. The entire room fell silent. 120 guests turned their attention to the radiant bride. Sloane began her speech by systematically honoring every single person who had supposedly brought her to this perfect moment. Her voice was laced with an artificial sweetness that made my stomach turn. She profusely thanked her 5 bridesmaids for being her ultimate support system. She blew a kiss to the boutique designer who had spent 6 months hand-sewing the imported lace on her custom gown. She expressed deep, theatrical gratitude to the luxury wedding planner for flawlessly coordinating the entire weekend. Finally, she turned to Helen and Graham Vale, her voice dropping into a tone of profound, humble respect, thanking them for welcoming her into their extraordinary family. Then, she paused. Her eyes scanned the room, sweeping past the towering floral arrangements and the crystal chandeliers, until they landed exactly on table 24. The spotlight did not reach me, but her gaze was a spotlight all its own. "And of course, there is my sister," Sloane said into the microphone. A soft, indulgent smile played on her lips, the kind of smile you give a slightly disappointing child. "Quinn is my sister. She is a 911 dispatcher. That is probably the perfect job for someone who prefers handling other people's messes instead of building a life of her own." The delivery was flawless. It was pitched perfectly as an affectionate, self-deprecating family joke. The wealthy guests sitting at the tables surrounding me let out a collective, polite chuckle. They thought it was endearing. They thought it was the kind of harmless banter sisters shared. But my parents did not just chuckle. From their seats of honor next to the bride, my mother and father laughed the loudest. Their laughter rang out over the microphone system, bright and entirely genuine. In that single, echoing sound, they unwittingly exposed the fundamental truth of our family dynamic. They had spent my entire life viewing me as a punchline, a secondary character, a drab accessory designed only to highlight Sloane's brilliant successes. A few weeks ago, that comment would have crushed me. I would have dropped my gaze, gripped the edges of my chair, and fought back the hot, humiliating tears that always threatened to spill over. I would have felt the familiar, agonizing sting of being rejected by the people who were biologically wired to protect me. But tonight, as the laughter washed over me, I realized something profound. I did not feel the sting. I did not feel the urge to run away, and I did not feel the desperate need to defend myself. The heavy, suffocating chain that had bound me to their approval simply snapped. I remained perfectly still in my chair, my face completely impassive. My calmness was no longer a symptom of endurance or submission. It was a conscious, permanent withdrawal. I was finally looking at them not as the parents I desperately wished they were, but as the incredibly small, cruel people they actually were. I did not need their validation anymore. They had nothing left that I wanted. From his seat right beside Sloane, Everett witnessed the entire moment unfold. He did not laugh. He did not even force a polite smile. His face was carved from stone, his eyes darting from Sloane's triumphant smirk to my quiet, shadowed silhouette at the back of the room, with absolute clarity. Everett understood exactly what he was watching. He realized that Sloane had never been trying to protect me from social pressure. As she had claimed at the rehearsal dinner, she was not shielding a delicate, fragile sister. She was actively, deliberately erasing me. She was using a microphone and an audience of 120 elite guests to bury my dignity alive. When the speech concluded and the jazz band struck up a lively tune, the guests returned to their expensive wine and animated conversations. I stood up from table 24, the cheap fabric of my dress brushing against the chair, and walked quietly toward the back exit of the tent. I needed to breathe actual oxygen, untainted by expensive perfume and heavy hypocrisy. I stepped out onto the secluded wooden porch overlooking the dark, rolling water of the harbor. The night air was freezing, but it felt clean. I had only been standing there for 2 minutes when the heavy canvas flap of the tent pushed open. My father walked out onto the porch, holding a half-empty glass of bourbon. He looked annoyed, as if my simple act of stepping outside was a personal inconvenience to him. "Quinn," he said, his voice carrying that familiar, dismissive edge. He took a sip of his drink, refusing to meet my eyes directly. "Do not make a big deal out of it just because Sloane is better at joking than you. It was just a toast. Do not ruin the mood of the evening by sulking out here in the dark." He expected me to look down. He expected me to apologize for making him uncomfortable. He expected the quiet, obedient daughter who always absorbed the blow to keep the peace. I turned my head slowly and looked him dead in the eyes. I did not raise my voice. I did not inject any anger or sorrow into my tone. I spoke with the terrifying, absolute precision of a woman who had nothing left to lose. "You did not laugh because it was funny," I said, my words dropping into the cold air like heavy stones. "You laughed because you agree." My father physically recoiled. His jaw dropped slightly, and the annoyed expression vanished, replaced by a sudden, jarring shock. He opened his mouth to formulate an excuse, to spin another lie. But the devastating accuracy of my statement completely stripped him of his usual defenses. He stood there, holding his expensive bourbon, utterly paralyzed by the truth. It was the very first time in 32 years that I had truly stabbed back, and the blade went straight to the bone. I did not wait for his response. I simply turned my back to him and looked out over the dark water. While I stood on the porch, Everett used the quiet to confirm what he already suspected. He returned to the study, reopened the hurricane file, and checked the records against what he had seen at the rehearsal dinner and at the reception. This time he was no longer searching for an explanation. He was measuring the size of the lie. By the time he looked up from the documents, he knew exactly what Sloane had done. I did not witness the conversation that broke my sister's kingdom in half. I would only learn the exact, agonizing details of it later, from the people who were actually inside that room. But the sequence of events was perfectly clear, while I remained standing on the freezing wooden deck, letting the saltwater breeze clear the suffocating hypocrisy from my lungs. The real catastrophe was silently unfolding in the climate-controlled sanctuary of the main house. Everett had not remained alone in his father's mahogany-paneled study. The moment he laid the county dispatch records across the heavy leather desk blotter and saw my name printed in stark black ink, he sent a second. Urgent message. Within 5 minutes. The heavy oak door swung open, and Helen Vale stepped into the room. Helen was a woman defined by her formidable grace. She wore her silver evening gown like armor, entirely accustomed to commanding respect in every room she entered. She closed the door behind her, clearly irritated by the interruption. The reception was operating at its peak. The jazz band was playing a lively set, and her son was supposed to be on the dance floor with his new bride. "Everett, what is going on?" Helen demanded, keeping her voice low but sharp.
"You are missing your own reception. Sloane is looking for you everywhere." Everett did not answer immediately.
He stood behind the massive desk, the ambient light from the brass reading lamp casting long, harsh shadows across his face. The tuxedo he wore suddenly looked like a costume he was desperate to take off, without a word. He turned the official county commendation document around and pushed it across the smooth leather surface toward his mother. Helen stepped forward, her brow furrowing in confusion. She picked up the thick, watermarked paper. Her eyes scanned the bureaucratic text, noting the date, the timestamp, and the specific geographic sector of the rescue. Then, her gaze locked onto the name of the dispatcher, Quinn Montgomery. The color drained entirely from Helen's face. The paper trembled slightly in her manicured hand. The universe of the Vale family, built on order and absolute control, suddenly violently tilted on its axis. "This is not possible," Helen whispered, staring blindly at the document. "This is Sloane's sister, the girl sitting by the kitchen doors. Are you telling me she is the one who saved your father?" "It is her," Everett replied, his voice completely devoid of emotion. It was the terrifying, flat tone of a man who had just realized his house was burning down with him locked inside it. "I heard her voice tonight. Mom, she used the exact same phrase to calm down your donor at the rehearsal dinner. It is her." Helen sank into one of the heavy leather guest chairs, utterly overwhelmed by the magnitude of the revelation. The woman they had been quietly honoring for 4 years. The phantom savior they had dedicated an entire charitable foundation to, had been sitting at table 24, eating a cold dinner while being publicly humiliated by the bride. But Everett was not finished. The discovery of my identity was only the first layer of the betrayal. He possessed a brilliant, analytical mind, trained to identify discrepancies in global logistics networks. Right now, that mind was ruthlessly dismantling his own relationship. He opened his personal laptop, which he had left on the corner of the desk, and rapidly logged into the secure administrative portal of the Vale Meridian First Responder Trust. It was the charitable foundation his parents had established exactly 4 years ago in honor of the unknown dispatcher. "There is a missing piece. Mom," Everett said, his fingers flying across the keyboard. "Think about how I met Sloane 2 years ago. She was working as a freelance consultant, and you hired her firm to coordinate the inaugural gala for the foundation." "Yes," Helen replied slowly, her mind struggling to keep pace with his terrifying logic. She was brilliant. She handled all the press, all the delicate social dynamics. "During our first creative meeting for that gala, I told her the origin story of the trust," Everett continued, his eyes locked on the glowing screen. "I told her about the hurricane, about Dad collapsing, and about the unknown female voice on the county radio who forced me to keep pumping his chest in the dark. I told her the exact date and the exact circumstances." Everett hit the search key. He was pulling up the archived administrative email server from 2 years ago, filtering the results specifically for correspondence between Sloane Montgomery and the Foundation's board of directors. "Quinn lives in the same county," Everett said, the horrifying truth materializing in the quiet room. "Quinn works the same shifts. Quinn must have mentioned that night to her family at some point. Sloane is not stupid. The moment I told her the story, she had to know it was her own sister." The search results populated on the screen. There was a long, deeply buried email chain between Sloane and Helen, dated exactly 2 weeks after that initial creative meeting. Everett turned the laptop so his mother could read the screen. The subject line, typed by Sloane, read "Confidential regarding the gala honoree." Helen leaned forward, her eyes darting across the glowing text. As she read her new daughter-in-law's carefully constructed words, the sheer sociopathic magnitude of the deception became undeniably clear. 2 years earlier, Sloane had identified Quinn as the dispatcher and chosen concealment over truth. In the email, she described her own sister as fragile, unstable, and incapable of handling public attention. The key line made her intent unmistakable. "Please do not elevate Quinn publicly. She misreads attention, and it could spiral." The room fell into a deathly, suffocating silence. The ticking of the antique grandfather clock in the corner sounded like a heavy hammer striking an anvil. Everett stepped back from the desk, running a trembling hand through his perfectly styled hair. He was no longer just angry. He was completely devastated. He looked at the glowing screen, realizing that the entire foundation of his marriage was an intricate, horrifying transaction built entirely on lies, manipulation, and the systematic destruction of another human being. Sloane had not just stolen my moment of recognition. She had meticulously ensured that I would never possess any value in the eyes of the people who mattered most to him. She had turned my silence against me, using it as proof of my supposed instability. Helen stood up from the leather chair. The elegant, polite facade of the wealthy matriarch was completely gone, replaced by the terrifying, cold fury of a woman who realized she had been expertly played. She looked at her son, her eyes burning with a dark, uncompromising clarity. She finally understood why I had been placed at table 24. She understood why I had been hidden from the family photos, and why I had been publicly mocked during the toast. Helen looked at the email one last time, her voice dropping into a tone that made the air in the room freeze solid. She did not just hide your sister. She trained us to misjudge her. I had stayed on the freezing wooden porch just long enough to let the bitter wind numb my face and clear my mind. I had made my final decision. There was no reason to return to table 24. There was no reason to stay for the dancing, and absolutely no reason to watch my family cut a massive 5-tier cake and pretend we were bound by love. I just needed to retrieve my wool coat from the guest cloakroom inside the main house and call a cab to take me back to my quiet apartment. The reception tent was loud and chaotic, completely oblivious to the impending destruction. But as I walked up the stone pathway toward the estate, the heavy thumping of the bass faded away. The main house was perfectly quiet. I walked down the long, dimly lit, carpeted corridor. As I neared the cloakroom, I noticed the heavy mahogany door to the private library was cracked open just a couple of inches. A sharp sliver of warm, golden light spilled out onto the Persian rug. I had absolutely no intention of eavesdropping on the Vale family, but the sheer, terrifying coldness of the voice drifting through the gap stopped me dead in my tracks. It was Everett. He did not sound like a joyful groom. The ambient noise of the party had been entirely stripped away, leaving only the acoustics of a closed courtroom. He sounded exactly like a prosecuting attorney delivering a closing argument in a capital trial. I stepped closer to the gap, holding my breath, hidden in the shadows of the hallway, inside the room. Sloane was standing in the center of the Persian rug. She was still wearing her imported silk wedding dress, the delicate lace catching the light. But the radiant bride persona had completely evaporated. She looked cornered, her posture rigid with panic. Helen Vale sat entirely motionless in a high-backed leather guest chair, her expression carved from absolute ice. Everett stood behind his father's massive desk. He pushed 2 distinct pieces of paper toward the front edge of the leather blotter. One was the official county commendation bearing my name. The other was the printed email chain from 2 years ago. "You knew," Everett said, his voice dropping into a deadly, quiet register that offered no avenue for escape. "You knew the person who saved my family was Quinn before we even got engaged. Did you not?" Sloane let out a high, brittle laugh. It was a panicked, deeply artificial sound. "Everett, this is ridiculous. I have no idea what you are talking about. You are misreading a completely innocent situation. It is just a massive coincidence." Everett did not blink. He did not raise his voice. "Do not lie to me. Not tonight. Not tonight. Not after I just read a confidential email where you actively told my mother that your own sister was mentally unstable to prevent us from contacting her." Sloane's posture shifted violently. The blatant denial crumbled, instantly replaced by her secondary defense mechanism, frantic justification. "I was just trying to avoid drama. Everett, you know what my family is like. Quinn is difficult. She is incredibly awkward. If you had brought her up to the foundation, if you had put a camera in her face, she would have completely crumbled under the pressure. I was protecting everyone. Protecting everyone," Everett repeated, the words dripping with absolute, unfiltered disgust. He stepped around the massive desk, closing the physical distance between them. He began to systematically dismantle her excuses, laying out the undeniable evidence of her cruelty. "You lied about her mental health. You forced her to sit by the swinging kitchen doors at table 24 tonight. You specifically instructed the photographer to leave negative space on the lawn so you could crop her out of your family history. You just humiliated her on a microphone in front of 120 guests. Was all of that just to avoid drama, Sloane, or was it a coordinated execution?" The relentless, suffocating pressure in the room finally broke her. The polished, heavily curated brand strategist vanished. What remained was the raw, ugly, festering jealousy she had harbored for 32 years. She slammed her hands down onto the back of a leather chair, her knuckles turning white. "I was not going to let my sister be the most talked about woman at my own wedding," Sloane screamed, her voice echoing violently off the wood-paneled walls. The confession tore out of her throat, brutal and completely honest. "Do you have any idea what it is like? Everett, I work constantly to be perfect. I curate every single detail of my life just to be noticed. And then there is Quinn. She does not care about anything. She wears cheap clothes. She works a horrible, depressing job. But the second a crisis happens, everyone looks at her, because she does not have to fake it. She just talks, and people instantly trust her. I spent 3 years building this relationship with your family I earned this day. I was not going to let her steal my spotlight just because she answered a phone during a storm 4 years ago." The silence that followed her outburst was deafening. She had finally admitted the terrifying truth. She did not exclude me because I was an embarrassment. She excluded me because she was terrified that if people truly saw me, they would realize how empty she actually was. Just as the echo of Sloane's screaming confession faded, heavy, hurried footsteps sounded in the hallway right behind me. My mother and father brushed past me, barely registering my presence in the dim light, and pushed the library door wide open. "Sloane, darling, the caterers are waiting for the official cake cutting," my mother began, her voice fluttering with a desperate, forced cheerfulness. But the moment she crossed the threshold and saw the lethal, unyielding expressions on Everett and Helen's faces, her voice died in her throat. My father looked at the documents spread across the desk. He looked at Sloane's flushed, furious face and the tears of rage ruining her perfect makeup. They both instantly understood that the grand facade had completely collapsed. This was the exact moment parents were supposed to express horror. This was the moment they were supposed to realize the profound, sociopathic cruelty their eldest daughter had inflicted upon their youngest, and demand accountability. Instead, my mother turned to Everett, clasping her hands together in a sickening, pleading gesture. "Everett, please, let us not do this right now. We can discuss all of this tomorrow privately. Do not ruin tonight over a silly family matter. You are upsetting your bride." Through her words, they completely indicted themselves. They were not victims of Sloane's manipulation. They were her willing, active accomplices. They would happily step over my bleeding body if it meant keeping the party going. Standing just outside the doorway, bathed in the dim light of the corridor, I felt a strange, profound sense of absolute peace wash over my soul. I had finally heard enough to understand the entire architecture of my misery. I had not imagined my exclusion. I had not been overly sensitive. They had truly built this cage together, layer by layer, lie upon lie. My sister provided the malice, and my parents provided the permission. Everett looked at my parents with a disgust so pure it practically vibrated in the air. He did not bother to answer my mother. Instead, his gaze shifted past them, looking directly through the open doorway. He saw me standing in the hall. The fury in his eyes vanished the second he looked at me. It was replaced by something I had never received from anyone in my own bloodline: absolute, unwavering, profound respect. He walked right past his furious bride. He walked past my complicit parents. He stopped right at the threshold of the door, standing directly in front of me. "If you can stay 5 more minutes," Everett said, his voice steady and clear, "I am done letting them tell your story for you." I walked back into the main reception tent, trailing a few minutes behind the rest of them. I stayed entirely in the shadows, leaning against the thick canvas wall near the back exit. The atmosphere inside was buzzing with manufactured joy. The jazz band was playing a soft, romantic melody, signaling that it was time for the final dance and the official cutting of the towering 5-tier cake. Everett walked straight toward the center of the dance floor. He did not look at his bride. He signaled the band to stop playing and reached out to take the silver microphone from the lead singer. The sudden silence in the room was immediate and absolute. 120 guests turned their attention toward him, expecting a tearful, romantic declaration of love to close out the flawless evening. Sloane glided over to stand beside him. She placed a delicate manicured hand on his arm, flashing a radiant, camera-ready smile. She clearly believed he was stepping up to do damage control. Assuming he was going to smooth over the awkward tension and reaffirm her perfect image before the night ended. Before we cut the cake, I want to take a moment to thank a few people. Everett began. His voice was not warm. It was dangerously calm, echoing through the expensive speakers with the heavy, unyielding weight of an incoming storm. Actually, I need to tell all of you a story. A story about how my family made it to this room tonight. Sloane's smile wavered just a fraction of an inch. She subtly tightened her grip on his arm. But Everett stepped away, leaving her hand hovering in the empty air. 4 years ago, during Hurricane Delphine, our family home flooded, Everett said, looking out over the crowd. The water surged, the power grid collapsed, and we were trapped in absolute darkness, in the middle of that nightmare. My father suffered a massive cardiac arrest. He collapsed in the water. I was entirely alone, terrified, and watching him die. I managed to get a phone line out to the county emergency dispatch. A woman answered the call. She could not send an ambulance, but she refused to let me give up. She stayed on the line with me for over 20 minutes in the pitch black. She taught me how to save him. When I was crying, when I was completely ready to let the dark take over. She gave me a rhythm. She told me to push on his chest, and she gave me an exact command. Everett paused. The luxurious tent was so quiet that I could hear the ocean waves crashing against the dock outside. She said to me, "Count with me." "Do not count your fear," Everett recited, his voice cracking slightly with raw, unfiltered emotion. At the head table, Graham Vale gasped audibly, his hand flying to his chest. Helen Vale immediately stood up from her chair, tears already spilling over her eyelashes. I stood perfectly still by the canvas wall, my breath catching in my throat. I had kept that terrifying night locked in a solitary vault inside my own mind for years. Hearing it spoken aloud, watching it finally find its way back to the surface in this grand, glittering room, was a surreal and shattering experience. Everett turned slowly, his eyes scanning the room until he found me standing in the shadows. He pointed directly at me. "That woman," Everett declared, his voice rising in power and absolute conviction, "is Quinn Montgomery, the woman sitting at table 24, the woman who was just publicly humiliated on this very microphone by my bride, while her own parents sat here and laughed." A collective, horrified gasp rippled through the 120 guests. The polite, cultured veneer of the room shattered instantly. People turned in their chairs, staring at me not with pity, but with profound, staggering awe. Sloane's face drained of all color. She lunged forward, desperately reaching for the microphone. "Everett, stop it. You are confused. Please do not do this right now." He easily dodged her grasp, pulling his cell phone from his tuxedo pocket. "I am not confused," Everett continued, his voice echoing relentlessly. "I am just finally awake. I want everyone to understand that the disrespect shown to Quinn tonight was not a spontaneous joke. It was a calculated, strategic campaign that lasted for years." Everett looked at his glowing screen and began to read. 2 years ago, Sloane discovered that Quinn was the one who saved my father. Instead of telling us, she sent a confidential email to my mother to ensure we never contacted her. She wrote, and I quote, "Please do not elevate Quinn publicly. She misreads attention, and it could spiral." She convinced us that her sister was mentally unstable simply because she was terrified that Quinn's genuine heroism would overshadow her own curated perfection. The silence that followed was horrifying. It was the sound of an entire social kingdom collapsing. My mother covered her face with her hands, shrinking down into her chair, while my father stared blankly at the tablecloth, utterly destroyed by the public exposure of their complicity. Graham Vale pushed his chair back and stood up. The wealthy, powerful patriarch of the logistics empire looked across the room directly at me. He bypassed the microphone entirely, his booming voice carrying across the tables. You are the reason I am standing here breathing tonight. You are the reason I get to see my son. I owe you my life." Helen Vale stepped out from behind the head table, her silver gown shimmering. She did not care about the optics or the ruined aesthetic of the wedding. She looked at me, her face flushed with shame and profound gratitude. "Quinn, I am so deeply, terribly sorry that we believed a false image of you. We were blind. Please, come up here. Your place is at the Vale family table." I did not move. I just looked at the people who had finally seen the truth. Everett turned to Sloane for the final time. She was shaking violently, her perfect dress looking like a heavy, suffocating trap. "The wedding is over. Sloane," Everett said, his voice dropping to a freezing temperature. "I will not be signing or filing the marriage certificate tonight. The honeymoon is canceled. We will not be moving forward with any shared property plans, and my lawyers will contact you on Monday." Cornered, humiliated, and stripped of all her power, Sloane completely unraveled. She pointed a trembling finger at me across the room, her voice a shrill, hysterical shriek. "She did this. She always waits for a chance to steal the spotlight. She planned this whole thing to ruin my life. She waited for the crowd to agree with her. She waited for my parents to jump to her defense." But no one laughed. No one nodded. The 120 guests stared at her with unfiltered disgust. Even my parents remained frozen in their seats, entirely unable to save her from the devastating silence she had brought upon herself. I did not walk up to the stage. I did not want a dramatic, screaming confrontation, and I certainly did not want to claim a victory prize. I stood tall in my cheap blue dress, looking at my sister and the parents who had allowed her to break me for decades. I did not need a microphone for my voice to carry. "I do not need your table," I said, my voice clear, cold, and entirely steady. "I do not want your apologies. I just need everyone in this room to stop calling my silence small." Without another word, I turned around and pushed through the canvas flap of the tent, stepping out into the freezing, liberating night air. I did not run. I walked with absolute dignity down the long, illuminated gravel driveway toward my car. Before I could reach my vehicle, I heard hurried footsteps crunching on the stones behind me. It was Helen and Graham Vale. They had left the ruined reception to follow me out into the cold. Helen reached out, gently touching my arm, her eyes full of genuine respect. She walked with me all the way to my driver's side door, ensuring I did not leave alone. Graham stood beside her, pulling a sleek business card from his pocket. "Quinn, my company is launching a new statewide funding program next month, the Vanguard Dispatcher Support Initiative. We need a director who actually understands the reality of the headset. We need someone with your exact strength. Call me on Monday." I took the card, feeling the embossed lettering under my thumb. I looked back once at the glowing tent in the distance. Inside, my sister's version of the world was collapsing. As I started the engine and drove away, I understood something simple at last. Revenge was never the point. Being seen clearly was. Thank you all for listening to this story. Please let me know in the comments where you are listening from so we can connect and share our thoughts. I invite you to subscribe to the Helena Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and support me further by pressing the hype button so that the story in this video can be heard by even more people.